Thank you for joining us as we explore one of the most unsettling instances in American history. Today, we'll explore the murky depths of the Appalachian, where a whole family disappeared in the bitterly cold winter in 1842. You should be aware that this narrative has never been fully resolved, so please let us know where you are seeing it. Everything in Harlan County, Kentucky, started to come apart in December. At that time, the Appalachian Mountains were a location of almost complete seclusion. Deep gorges, thick oak and pine forests, and a persistent fog that seemed to engulf all sounds kept families apart for days at a time. The streams were starting to freeze at the banks, as the bitter cold of that winter had arrived earlier than anticipated. There, family secrets were hidden beneath layers of custom and silence. The law was hardly enforced, and it took weeks for sheriffs to search the valleys. On the highest slopes of the Pine Mountain region, the Callahan family occupied a secluded homestead. There were 7 of them: Thomas Callahan, the patriarch, his wife Martha, and their 5 children, ages 4 to 16. Thomas was regarded as a quiet, hardworking man who didn't say much. Years before, he had constructed his own cabin out of chestnut logs that he had personally felled. The major trail that led to the small town of Cumberland Gap from the few farms in the area was almost a mile away from the property. They were rarely seen. In that era and location, this was not out of the ordinary. Families in Appalachia may be cut off from their neighbors for months at a time, particularly in the winter when the trails were impassable. The Callahans, however, were different in some way. A few of their nearest neighbors who lived 3 miles away said that the family appeared to be continuously on guard and keeping an eye on the shadows, as though they thought something horrible would suddenly appear from the woods. On November 23, 1842, the final known communication with the family took place. Thomas had visited the local shop to purchase kerosene for the lights, wheat, salt, basic supplies, and rifle ammunition. The transaction was noted in an account book kept in the County Historical Archives by Samuel Porter, the store's proprietor. Investigators would subsequently learn from Samuel that Thomas appeared anxious, agitated, and always looked back as though he were being pursued. Thomas just muttered something about winter approaching and hurried off when Samuel asked how things were going. Nobody saw Thomas Callahan again after that, living or his relatives. The first few weeks of December went by without incident. As I indicated, it was not uncommon to become disoriented when families were secluded in the winter. However, Rebecca Mills, a neighbor, started to worry as Christmas drew near. Before the holidays, she had assured Martha Callahan that she would bring some handmade bread and preserves. It was a custom among the few local women, a means of preserving interpersonal relationships in the midst of the mountain's isolation. Rebecca traveled a great distance, too. The Callahan property on December 26th. The trails were covered in an ankle-deep white layer due to the heavy snowfall in the previous days. It took her almost 4 hours to get there, and when she eventually made out the cabin through the trees, she felt uneasy. There were no sounds of children playing or animals in the small barn next to the home, nor was there any smoke emanating from the chimney. The wind whispering through the naked branches was the only sound breaking the utter silence. Rebecca yelled at the Callahans. Nobody responded. She went to knock on the front door. Softly at first, then louder. Nothing. Unusually, the door was unlocked. Homes in Appalachia were usually locked, especially at night. Slowly, Rebecca opened the door, and the sound of rusting hinges reverberated throughout the deserted house. It was frigid inside the cabin. It had been days or even weeks since the fireplace was removed. The table was covered with dishes, as though a meal had been cut short. On the wood stove, an iron kettle still held the remnants of stew that was frozen solid. There were no indications of a struggle, no damaged furniture, and no signs of violence on the wooden walls, but the beds were unmade and blankets were thrown aside as if someone had gotten up quickly. Rebecca explored every room in the house. She discovered the family Bible open on a little table by the window, unopened personal items, and clothing in the closets, but no people. The 7 Callahan family members had just disappeared, as though they had been taken out of the world in the dead of the night of winter. Shocked, Rebecca hurried home and informed her husband of her discovery. Before dusk, he quickly assembled 3 more local men, and they made their way back to the Callahan farm. They went through the home, the barn, and the little chicken coop once more. Strangely, the creatures had also vanished. A horse, multiple hens, and 2 cows. They were just gone. However, there were no footsteps or traces in the snow. Heading off the property, there was no indication that anything or anyone had lately passed by. The news slowly made its way from valley to valley and from farm to farm across the mountains. The Harland County Sheriff eventually showed there to conduct an investigation in early January of 1843. He searched the region for 3 days with 2 deputies. In the barn, they discovered something unsettling. The compacted dirt floor showed strange scars, like something heavy had been dragged across it. However, the marks stopped short of continuing past the barn. Whatever had been dragged seemed to have just disappeared. Sheriff William Hadley was an experienced individual who had fought against illegal organizations in the Highlands. In his 15 years as a law enforcement officer in Kentucky, he had witnessed many horrific things, but nothing like this. Not only was there no blood or body, but there was also no obvious evidence of foul play. In the Appalachian valleys, a whole family vanished like morning mist. Hadley started interrogating all of the Callahans' acquaintances. Actually, there weren't many. The family had just been in the neighborhood for 3 years. Earlier, from an Eastern Virginia location. Nobody was certain of the exact location. Martha was even more reticent, and Thomas never discussed his history. It was rare to see the children in the hamlet, and when they did, they appeared scared, holding to their mother's skirts and gazing at the ground. About 4 miles from the Callahan property, a farmer named Ezekiel Thornton told the sheriff something unsettling. He claimed that he had been deer hunting in the mountains for roughly 2 weeks prior to his disappearance when he heard cries coming from the Callahan farm's way. The screams reverberated through the trees, high-pitched and frantic. Ezekiel thought about checking, but it was already dusk and there was a long way to go. He acknowledged his fear as well. "I'm terrified of what could occur on that remote property, not the Callahans." After a few minutes, the scream ended, and Ezekiel went back home, trying to convince himself that it had all been a dream. Jacob, an elderly man, is another neighbor. Reeves disclosed that on multiple November evenings, he had noticed odd lights in the woods close to the Callahan property. They weren't your typical campfires or lanterns. They were faint, nearly bluish lights that seemed to float among the trees. Even Jacob, who was regarded as a rational guy who was not prone to superstition, acknowledged that these lights greatly worried him. One evening he attempted to follow them, but they constantly appeared to be farther away than they actually were, and finally they vanished. Entirely. Everything was documented by Sheriff Hadley in his official journal, which is currently kept in the Harland County Archives. While looking through the store's records, he also made an important discovery. Prior to his abduction, Thomas Callahan had bought an abnormally high quantity of salt, whole sacks of rock salt, the kind used to preserve meat throughout the long winters, instead of just regular cooking salt. The proprietor of the shop, Samuel Porter, calculated that Thomas had bought enough salt, too. Save a whole steer, if not more. However, there was no beef. The house was devoid of preserved meat. The only items in the pantry were some rotten bread and that frozen stew in the saucepan. The sheriff broadened the search in the middle of January. 20 volunteers were assembled by him, and they searched the woods around the Callahan property for almost 15 miles. Days passed while they sought, enduring knee-deep snow and nighttime lows well below freezing. All they discovered were trees, ice-covered rocks, and the mountains' suffocating quiet. One of the volunteers then made a startling find on the 5th day of the search. About 2 miles north of the Callahan property, he discovered a secret ravine. A piece of cloth lay at the bottom of the gully, half covered by snow and fallen trees. It was a ripped, filthy, but yet identifiable child's dress. Rebecca Mills knew it right away. Sarah, the Callahan family's 4-year-old youngest daughter, owned it. There was a stain on the dress, but not blood. No one could recognize it. It was something else, something viscous and dark. The sheriff ordered a thorough search of the valley and carefully gathered the garment. Snow, leaves, and other debris were removed from the entire area over the course of 2 days, but nothing additional was discovered. Not a body, not another article of clothes, no sign of the Callahans. The society was rife with theories. Some people thought the family had left during the night, perhaps because they were afraid of someone or something. However, that didn't elucidate why they would abandon all they owned, including Thomas's savings and the family Bible, which were discovered concealed in a coffee can in the kitchen. By today's standards, it was a fortune, valued at $43 in gold coins. Without leaving that behind, no family would run away. Darker things were whispered by others. Ancient legends about monsters who lived in the deep forests of the Appalachian Mountains have been passed down from generation to generation. Some of the ancient land spirits, which existed long before European immigrants arrived, were mentioned by older residents. They claimed that people who built their homes in prohibited areas or ventured too far were occasionally dragged away by these spirits. Even Sheriff Hadley, who rejected superstition, had to acknowledge that there was no rational explanation for the case. For weeks, he persisted in his investigation, visiting nearby towns to ask if anyone had spotted a family of 7 on the road. He gave stage advice, coached documents, and conversed with traders on the roads of Appalachia. The Callahans had gone unnoticed. An even stranger incident happened in February. About 6 miles from the Callahan farm, Daniel McKinney, a fur trapper, was setting traps by a frozen creek when he discovered something strange. It was a book that was partially frozen in the creek ice and entirely soaked. He found it to be a diary, Martha Callahan's diary, after he was able to free it and carry it to dry by the fire. Daniel grabbed the journal right away to the sheriff. Even though the pages were water-damaged and many of the lines were unreadable, the content sent shivers down the spines of everyone who read them. Martha wrote of terrora persistent, escalating fear that plagued her every day. She said that Thomas had seen things in the woods, but he wouldn't elaborate. She described the children's horrific nightmares, how they would wake up in the middle of the night screaming, and how they would talk about people in the windows. Midway through November, Martha wrote in an entry. Authored a piece that didn't make much sense. What we've concealed is what they desire. We must leave, but where? They'll find us anywhere. Who were they? What had the family hidden? Thomas asks. The diary only provided unsettling glimpses of a fearful family spending their last days in increasing fear. 2 days prior to Thomas's last visit to the store, on November 21st, the last readable journal entry was made. Martha's writing was unsteady and frantic, with only 5 words. Handwriting. The door is being knocked on. The investigation was totally changed when the journal was found. Sheriff Hadley understood that he was not dealing with a straightforward escape or disappearance. Behind the scenes, something more evil and profound was at work. He made the decision to conduct another search of the Callahan property. This time, The search was focused on finding anything the family might have concealed that would be valuable enough to draw unwanted notice. 3 entire days were spent on the search. Hadley and his troops physically took parts of the cottage apart, removed floorboards, looked for hidden rooms in the walls, and excavated the foundation. They discovered something on the second day. There was a little void in the fireplace beneath a loose stone. There were some old yellow documents within, wrapped in oilcloth. The documents were property deeds to land in eastern Virginia close to the North Carolina border, not to the farm where the Callahan's family resided. The 1823 deeds were registered in a man's name, Jonathan Whitmore. The actions were accompanied by old letters that told a troubling tale. In Virginia, Jonathan Whitmore had been a successful tobacco dealer. According to the letters, he may have obtained his land by deceiving indigenous families who continued to oppose the Europeans' development. Whitmore was alerted to threats he had received in one of the letters from a lawyer named Herbert Moss. People refused to accept financial compensation and demanded the return of their land. The letter ended with a dire warning. "Jonathan, you ought to think about getting out of this area. Our courts are powerless over some forces at play here." However, what was the relationship between Thomas Callahan and Jonathan Whitmore? Sheriff Hadley started looking into family histories and lineages. Weeks passed before he finally discovered the truth. In reality, Jonathan's grandson Thomas Whitmore was Thomas Callahan. In an apparent attempt to get away from something related to his grandfather's past, he had altered his last name. This insight made it possible, too. Even more unsettling hypotheses. Is it possible that Thomas was being pursued by the descendants of the families Jonathan Whitmore tricked? That they had at last located him and his family, who were sheltering in the mountains of Kentucky? However, this did not account for the animals' disappearance, the absence of bodies, or even the total lack of tangible proof. In order to look into the properties listed in the deeds, the sheriff made the decision to go to Virginia. The approximately 200-meter excursion required days of horseback riding through challenging terrain. He started out in March of 1843, bringing copies of the documents he had discovered along with one of his subordinates. Even more remote than Harlan County was the area where Jonathan Whitmore's farm was located. It was located in Devil's Fork, a tiny valley encircled by towering mountains and forests so thick that sunlight hardly reached it, deep in the Appalachian foothills. There were no more than 20 households living in Blackwater, the smallest settlement nearby. When Hadley got to Blackwater, he started to inquire. When she asked queries about Jonathan Whitmore, she received no response. They genuinely refused to talk. In her face, doors banged shut. People's conversations were cut short. The name Whitmore itself seemed to be frowned upon, something that should never be mentioned out loud. Hadley eventually located an old man who was open to conversation. He was in his 80s and went as Nathaniel Cross. Nathaniel's face darkened at the mention of Jonathan Whitmore, whom he recalled well. He guided the sheriff out of the community, too, a remote area in the forest. Nathaniel began by stating that Jonathan Whitmore had, in fact, stolen land from a family called Blackwood. The Blackwoods were not your typical colonists. Long before the majority of villages were established, they were the descendants of one of the first families to arrive in the area. They had a unique quality that people didn't want to talk about in public. They followed customs that originated far away, from across the seas, and combined ancient ceremonies, using even earlier customs that they had picked up from the land's original indigenous inhabitants. The family chose not to go to court when Jonathan took the Blackwood holdings in 1823. They took a different action. Although Nathaniel did not elaborate, he was sure that Jonathan Whitmore and all his successors were cursed by the Blackwoods. Just 2 years later, Jonathan passed away inexplicably. Although his body was discovered in the forest, the specifics were never formally documented. Thomas, his son, when Thomas was still a child, his father had vanished entirely. A chill went through Hadley's body. The story had an unsettling consistency, but he didn't believe in witchcraft or curses. He questioned Nathaniel about the Blackwood's continued presence in the neighborhood. Slowly, shaking his head, the elderly man gestured toward the eastern, deeper mountains. They remained. They had been all along. They would always be. The sheriff made the decision to track down the Blackwoods and face them head-on. Nathaniel. He gave him ambiguous instructions but refused to lead him, claiming he hadn't been in that area of the forest for decades and didn't want to start now. For around 8 miles, follow the main stream up the valley. Follow a trail that has been designated with stacked boulders until it comes to an end. The following morning, Hadley and his assistant set out. The trip proved to be more challenging than they had expected. The terrain became steeper and the trees became denser. They followed a creek that was partially frozen, forming patterns of ice that resembled twisted fingers extending towards the sky. They eventually located the heaped stones Nathaniel had mentioned after hours of hard walking. The track that led from there was nearly undetectable, encircled by old trees that appeared to lean over them and covered in moss. The trail eventually came to an end in a small clearing after they traveled for an additional 2 miles. A cabin, unlike other Appalachian homes, stood in the middle of the clearing. It had a low, lichen-covered roof and was constructed of black stone. Smoke emerged from a chimney, a sign that someone was within. Introducing himself as the sheriff, Hadley cried out. There was no response. He called louder once more. A figure appeared as the cabin door slowly opened. The elderly woman's skin felt like parchment stretched over bones because she was so ancient. Hadley felt as though she could see right through him, reading every secret and every thought, because of her nearly colorless, pale gray eyes. The woman observed without comment. Hadley gave an explanation for her presence, citing the documents she had discovered, the disappearance, and Callahan's. The woman's demeanor remained unchanged while she listened to everything. She eventually spoke once Hadley was done, and her voice sounded like wind-blown dried leaves. There was only one thing she said. The debt has been settled. Like a last word, the woman's remarks lingered in the chilly mountain air. The woman merely withdrew back into the stone cabin and shut the door when Hadley attempted to probe further, demanded explanations, and even threatened legal action, regardless of how much. She didn't answer when he knocked or yelled out. It seemed as though she had said everything she needed to say and that saying anything more would be pointless. A young man named Peter Hollis, the sheriff's deputy, was clearly shaken. He pleaded with them to get out of there right away. Every survival instinct cried out for flight because there was a serious problem here. Despite her skepticism, Hadley had to concur. Even though it was mid-after, the clearing seemed to absorb daylight, making everything darker than it should have been. Afternoon. Hadley detected something unsettling about the stone cabin as they were getting ready to leave. He couldn't identify the symbols on the ground, which were circles carved into the frozen ground. Additionally, there were little bones that were softly swaying in the breeze while hanging on threads from the trees that surrounded the clearing. The bones were not human. There were dozens of them, and they made a hypnotic, truly unnerving clinking sound, but at least they didn't seem to be. The journey. Driven by a strong desire to leave those dark mountains behind, the trip back to Blackwater took less time than the one out. It was already night when they arrived in the village, and Nathaniel Cross was waiting for them in the town's sole tavern. After glancing at them, the elderly man recognized their location instantly. He just poured strong whiskey, told them they'd better go at daybreak, and didn't ask any questions. Hadley had a hard time falling asleep in the tiny Blackwater Inn that night. He couldn't stop thinking about what the woman had said. The debt was settled. What did that actually mean? Where were the bodies of the Callahans, and had they been murdered as retribution for atrocities Thomas's ancestor had committed decades before? Why wasn't there any tangible proof of violence? Before departing, Hadley spoke with Nathaniel one more time in the morning. Perhaps, since he was aware that the sheriff would soon leave and never come back, the elderly guy was more open to conversation. Nathaniel recounted historical tales about the Blackwoods, down in the mountains from generation to generation. He claimed that the family's knowledge dated back to a time before the first settlers arrived in the United States. Understanding how to manipulate reality and navigate between this world and other realms that exist in the shadows, in the gaps between what we can see and what we would rather not see. The Blackwoods marked the entire line when they marked someone, according to Nathaniel. It was more than retaliation. Something was involved, more profound and basic. It was about healing a wound in the natural order of things, about bringing things back into equilibrium. And nothing in this world could stop it when the time came to collect what was owed. Hadley had more questions than answers when he left Virginia. He made an effort to arrange his ideas and produce a coherent official report on the lengthy drive back to Kentucky. But what could he say about what he'd found? How could he report the disappearance of a family in a formal county document? Maybe because of a curse that was placed 20 years ago. He would be made fun of and might even lose his job. In mid-April, he returned to Harlan County to find more unsettling news. 3 others had vanished while he was away. They were individuals who had been on the property following the disappearance, not members of the Callahan family. One evening, one of the men who had assisted with the initial search just failed to come home. For days, his wife looked for him, but he had disappeared as thoroughly as the Callahans. A woman who had stolen some clothing from the Callahan residence, believing it would be useless, also disappeared without a trace 2 weeks later. The community started to feel panicked. Even when they were passing by the deserted property, people avoided discussing the Callahans. Some started whispering that the land was cursed and that anyone who touched anything that belonged to the family or stepped on it would be the next to vanish. Sheriff Hadley came to a conclusion. He was unable to resolve this case in a conventional manner because it wasn't one. In his incredibly ambiguous official report, he claimed that the Callahan family had reportedly left the area for unspecified reasons and that despite intensive search efforts, they had not been located. He made reference to the diary and the dress discovered in the ravine, but he made no mention whatsoever of his visit to Virginia or of all he had discovered about the Blackwoods. However, Hadley also maintained a private journal that was kept apart from the official documents. This journal, which he recorded every unsettling detail, odd encounter, and terrifying moment he had experienced in the Virginia mountain saul of which would only be found more than a century later. He wrote about his own skepticism and how a well-educated, sensible man could start to believe things that were completely counter to logic. The sheriff gave the order to burn the Callahan property in May of 1843. As his official defense, he pointed to worries about the safety of the structure and the possibility of an unintentional fire spreading through the forest. However, everyone was aware of the actual cause. His goal was to clear the area and remove any evidence of the family that had been engulfed in mystery. The whole night the cabin burned. For miles the flames could be seen, casting a spooky orange glow over the mountains. Witnesses claimed to have heard odd noises emanating from the fire, resembling screams. However, as they approached, they discovered it was nothing more than the sound of burning wood crackling and the wind rustling through the trees. By morning, all that was left was blackened ash, stone. With the destruction of the last physical remnant of the Callahans, The community hoped that the nightmare would come to an end and the disappearances would cease. And it appeared to work for a while. The disappearances ceased. The monotony of hard labor and seclusion that characterized mountain life returned. However, the case was never really resolved. There was no satisfactory explanation for the disappearance of 7 people. The county archives kept the deeds and documents discovered in the fireplace, but they were eventually forgotten. For many years. Although no one was certain of the specific type of evidence, Martha's water-damaged diary was kept as proof. Before retiring, Sheriff William Hadley served for an additional 12 years. He never looked into disappearances in the isolated mountain regions again. Some claimed that something inside of him had broken or perhaps woken up after that case, and that he had changed. He spoke less, drank more, and occasionally had a barely disguised, terrified expression on his face as he gazed eastward at the mountains. Years went by, and the Callahan family's tale gradually turned into a local folk tale. The horrible winter of 1842 was described to younger generations by older generations, always in low voices and with a nervous look at the shadows. However, as is the case with all oral histories, some details were added, others were lost, and the truth was hidden beneath layers of fear and conjecture. The region started to grow a little more in the 1850s. The Cumberland Gap settlement expanded significantly. New families moved in, and roads were upgraded. The former Callahan land, eventually it was sold at public auction for unpaid taxes, and it was reduced to a burned area of land covered in new growth. A farmer named Augustus Webb bought it for a pittance, ignoring the warnings of older residents. On the location of the Callahan cabin, Augustus constructed a new home. He was a pragmatic man from the East who didn't believe in ghost stories or curses. Everything appeared to be normal for the first few months. He farmed the land, raised some livestock, and began making plans to expand his property. His wife, Catherine, was pregnant with their first child, and they saw this place as the beginning of a prosperous new life. But in the fall of 1854, strange things began to happen. Augustus would wake in the middle of the night, hearing footsteps outside the house. But when he checked, no one was there. Catherine swore she saw shadows moving in the corners of the rooms, figures that disappeared when she tried to look directly. The animals became restless, especially the horses who refused to approach certain areas of the property. In November of that year, exactly 12 years after the Callahans disappeared, Catherine gave birth. The labor was difficult, and the child was born prematurely. It was a boy, but there was something deeply wrong with him. The midwife who attended the birth refused to go back to the house because she was so upset. She whispered that the child had odd markings on his skin, symbols that shouldn't be there, but she wouldn't describe exactly what she saw. The infant lived for just 3 days. In a tiny temporary cemetery at the rear of the property, Augustus and Catherine laid him to rest. After 2 weeks, Catherine started experiencing night terrors. She cried out that there were kids at the windows, 5 of them with pale faces observing her while their tiny hands tapped on the glass. Catherine was so certain that she eventually refused to sleep in any room with windows facing the forest, even though Augustus ran to check and found nothing. Augustus decided to vacate the estate at the beginning of December. He had put all of his money into the land, but it had not paid off. Catherine was about to lose her mind. The sensation of being watched all the time was intolerable, and he himself was starting to see things he couldn't explain. Taking only what they could carry, they departed on a chilly morning and never came back. Once more, the house was deserted. Nobody else made an attempt to purchase the land. It just stayed empty, gradually being taken back by the forest. Trees grew through and around the ruins over the decades. Augustus's home, turning it into a mossy, vine-covered skeleton. The Kentucky mountains became disputed territory during the American Civil War, which raged from 1861 to 1865. The area was frequently traversed by both Union and Confederate forces. A troubling incident that happened in the fall of 1863 is documented in military records. 23 Union soldiers were encamped close to the site of the former Callahan estate. The history of the place was unknown to them. They were just tired men looking to rest before moving on with their march. 2 sentries vanished from their posts on the first night. They were initially believed to have deserted, but it was odd that 2 men would desert at the same time without bringing any gear. 3 more soldiers disappeared on the second night. James Morrison, a captain, was the detachment commander this time, and he gave the order for everyone to remain together and maintain campfires burning all night. The soldiers said they heard noises emanating from the nearby woodland as though a sizable crowd was passing through the trees. However, whenever they attempted to use torches to illuminate the area, all they saw was unbreakable darkness. The whole detachment ran away in terror on the third night. Although the event was reported as a surprise attack by Confederate guerrillas in official Union records, Captain Morrison's personal diary, which was found decades later, provides a different account. He described the utter horror of seeing pale figures emerge from the woods, captivated his men of how he perceived things that were incomprehensible. Just 16 of the initial 23 soldiers survived. The bodies of the other 7 simply vanished and were never located. Attempts were made to further develop the Appalachian region during the Reconstruction era following the war. The old-growth oak and chestnut forests in the mountains were being cut down by lumber companies, but workers routinely avoided the area where the former Callahan property was located. The most courageous men refused to work there for some reason. In spite of the surrounding deforestation, the trees in that specific area stayed intact, creating an island of old-growth forest. Edmund Blackthorne was a folklore scholar who traveled through the Appalachian region in the late 19th century, gathering local legends and stories. In 1896, he interviewed elderly people in Harland County for several weeks. He was the first to systematically record Callahan history, assembling statements, looking through old county documents, and even trying to find Sheriff Hadley's personal journal, which had not yet been located. The case captivated Blackthorne. Following in Hadley's footsteps from 53 years ago, he also made the trip to Virginia. However, he was unable to find the stone cabin in the mountains or the Blackwoods. There was just no longer the trail Nathaniel Cross had described. Or it might have never been there at all. There was still a Blackwater settlement, more deteriorated and smaller. However, the few survivors declined to discuss the Blackwoods. Some even denied the existence of such a family. Blackthorne, intrigued but frustrated, wrote a short book titled Dark Mysteries of the Appalachians in 1898. He made no effort to provide logical explanations, and the Callahan family chapter was the longest. He left it up to the reader to determine what to believe, instead presenting the facts as he had found them. Due to its small distribution, the book eventually. A few copies have survived in private collections and university libraries, but they have fallen into obscurity. Appalachia saw significant transformation in the 20th century. Better roads were constructed. Even the most isolated communities had access to electricity, and the sense of isolation that had long characterized the area started to fade. However, the old Callahan property remained unaltered despite all the modernization. Progress seemed to purposefully avoid this area of land. 81 years following the initial disappearance in 1923, a young historian by the name of Robert Thatcher chose to look into the case for his doctoral dissertation at the University of Kentucky. Thatcher had access to resources that Edmund Blackthorne did not, such as easier access to interstate travel and better organized government records. He immersed himself in the research for 2 years, and what he found was both fascinating and extremely unsettling. From Jonathan to Thomas Callahan, Thatcher was able to trace the entire Whitmore family line. He found a startling pattern. Every single, unfathomable tragedies had befallen the family's generation. Only young Thomas, an orphan at the age of 10, remained after Jonathan's wife and son, Edward Whitmore, vanished in 1836. Thomas's survival into adulthood is probably due to the fact that he was raised by distant uncles who did not have the Whitmore name. The documents Thatcher discovered about other members of the extended family, however, were the most unsettling. Anyone with Whitmore ancestry, including cousins and nephews, appeared to be marked by enigmatic disappearances or mysterious fatalities. 3 of Thomas's second cousins went missing in 1857 while passing through Tennessee. A distant cousin passed away in Ohio in 1872 under strange circumstances. Despite having no obvious wounds, her body was discovered in a forest with a frozen look of complete horror on her face. Thatcher's present was no exception to the pattern. He learned that the Whitmore family still had living descendants who were ignorant of their relationship to Jonathan, and the Virginia land that was stolen. The blood was the same, but most had changed their names over the generations, as Thomas had done when he took the surname Callahan. Thatcher made an effort to interview a few of these descendants. 3 consented to talk to him. Throughout their lives, all 3 of them reported strange experiences, such as recurrent nightmares about shadowy figures and dark forests, inexplicable feelings of being followed, and periods of extreme bad luck for which there was no logical explanation. William Patterson, a 42-year-old man, was one of them, and his remarks caused Thatcher to wonder if he should carry out more research. Our family is flawed in some way. There has always been. It seems like something has been pursuing us for generations, just waiting for the ideal opportunity. Equipped with this knowledge, Thatcher made the decision to take action that had not been taken in decades. See the historic Callahan estate firsthand. He eventually made the trip in the summer of 1925. The region was even more alone than he had anticipated. He had to hike the final 5 miles on old, almost undetectable trails because no contemporary roads could compare. He was astounded by how thoroughly nature had reclaimed the area when he eventually located it. Decades of vegetation had obscured the remnants of Augustus Webb's home, but they were still barely discernible. With their roots penetrating the stone foundations, trees grew through the spaces that had once been rooms. There was a silence in the area that Thatcher had never known. There were no sounds of birdsong, no. There was complete silence, with only tiny creatures scuttling through the brush. Thatcher started exploring with great care, using his heavy plate camera to take pictures and make notes. He discovered what he thought was the original fireplace in the Callahan cabin, which was now nothing more than a few blackened stones. He carefully excavated around them in the hopes of discovering additional artifacts that might have withstood the 1843 fire. He discovered the bones at that moment. They were meticulously placed in the ground, around 2 feet deep, so that they suggested intentional interment as opposed to straightforward disposal. Thatcher wasn't an anthropologist, but he knew enough about the fundamentals of anatomy to know that those were human bones, and not from a single individual. The size of the bones varied, indicating that there were several people of different ages. Thatcher dug harder, her hands trembling. In all, he discovered 7 skulls, 5 small, 1 medium, and 1 large. A whole family. The bones were accompanied by pieces of tissue that had withstood decomposition and were kept intact by an odd chemistry in the ground. And there was more. The bones are marked. Instead of signs of trauma or violence, they were engraved symbols that appeared to have been meticulously carved into each bone after death. Thatcher was aware of his remarkable discovery. The Callahan family's remains were most likely these. However, how had they arrived? Who had laid them to rest? And why, in all the searches that had been done 83 years before, had no one discovered them? He concluded that he required expert assistance. He made careful notes. The precise location of the bones, covered them with soil once more for protection, and started the process of returning to arrange a proper excavation with archaeologists and forensic anthropologists. However, this excavation was never planned by Thatcher. He started experiencing the same nightmares that Whitmore's descendants had talked about 3 days after he left the property. Shadowy figures, murmurs in unidentified languages, and a sense of being watched all the time. He made an effort to ignore it, attributing it to psychological stress. The cost of being in that location with a troubled past. A week later, Thatcher's car just abruptly swerved off the road while he was traveling on a major thoroughfare close to Lexington. According to the accident investigation, he may have lost control because of exhaustion. However, witnesses claimed to have seen something odd. They claimed that just before the collision, Thatcher swerved sharply to avoid what appeared to be figures in the road ahead of him. However, no one was on the scene when others arrived. Road apart from Thatcher and his crashed vehicle. Although he survived, Robert Thatcher suffered severe injuries. He was in the hospital for 3 months to recuperate from several fractures and a head injury. He was a different person when he was eventually freed. He gave up on studying the Callahan family entirely. He was told not to open the sealed box containing all of his documents, pictures, and notes. He spent the remainder of his academic career studying Kentucky after drastically altering his field of study. Economic history. Safe? Unremarkable subjects devoid of mysteries and cursed families. Until her passing in 1968, Thatcher's notes were kept secret. Unaware of the box's past, her heirs eventually gave it to the University of Kentucky archives, where it was cataloged but not thoroughly examined for many years. The Callahan family story lay dormant in the dusty archives of universities and libraries for years. The Second World War came and went, bringing its own mysteries and tragedies that eclipsed earlier mountain disappearance cases. The 1950s and 1960s saw a significant transformation in America. Even the most isolated areas of the Appalachians were transformed by technology, communication, and transportation. But the former Callahan property remained unaltered, an anomaly amid development. Attempts to clear the land for logging on occasion always ended in strange ways. Equipment malfunctioned for no apparent reason. Employees became sick or declined to work. Finally, the businesses just gave up and moved their attention elsewhere, leaving that specific forest patch as an unintentional haven. A group of college students who were curious about paranormal activity chose to spend a weekend in October of 1974, camping on the former property. They were 5 young men, all from the University of Kentucky, and they had audio recorders, cameras, and a lot of energy. After reading about the Callahan case in a little-known library reference, they believed it would be an exciting journey to look into possibly a haunted place. On a Friday afternoon, the group arrived, made camp in the old house's ruins, and got ready for a night of observation. Soon after dusk, the first odd noises appeared. It was hard to tell if the whispers coming from the nearby forest were imagined or real because they were so low. A young woman named Jennifer Walsh, one of the students, claimed to have seen figures moving among the trees, but they were always out of her direct line of sight. In advance. The audio recorders started to capture sounds at midnight that were not audible to the human ear but were audible on the tapes when they were played back. There were several voices talking at once, generating a clamor of murmurs. "Go back. It doesn't belong. The debt, we don't want them." At 2 o'clock in the morning, panic gripped the group. All 5 swore they saw the same thing. The words were partially understandable. The students fled in complete panic, leaving all their equipment behind, and ran down the dark trails, tripping over roots and rocks, until they reached the road where they had left their cars. They drove nonstop to Lexington, shaking and in shock at first, but then they saw 5 small children in old, torn clothing, their pale faces glowing faintly in the darkness, and their eyes were completely black with no visible whites. 2 days later, one of the students, a young man named Michael Torres, returned during the day to retrieve the abandoned equipment. He brought 2 friends who hadn't taken part in the original adventure to ensure witnesses. When they arrived at the campsite, they discovered something impossible. All the equipment was carefully arranged in an orderly pile in the center of the ruins. They had intended to report the incident to the police, but decided against it after realizing how ridiculous it would sound. The audio recorders were dismantled, their magnetic tapes unwound and spread in circular patterns around the pile of equipment. The cameras were open. The film was completely exposed to the light, making it useless, and the 5 students silently agreed never to return to that location or discuss what they had experienced in public. However, Jennifer Walsh kept a private journal in which she recorded everything, including the recurrent nightmares that plagued her for years afterward. Her diary would only be found decades later, adding yet another level of mystery. The Harlan County region saw a sharp economic downturn in the 1980s and 1990s. The coal industry, which had been the region's main source of income, collapsed. Many families left in search of better opportunities. Entire villages were abandoned, turning into ghost towns, and the already remote old Callahan property became even more remote as the few roads leading to it were abandoned and eventually engulfed by vegetation, and it was during this time of decline that tales about the property started to resurface with a renewed intensity. Hunters who ventured into the mountains reported strange experiences, including compasses that spun erratically, hunting dogs that would not go farther than a certain point, and oppressive feelings of being watched by multiple invisible eyes. Some claimed to have seen pale lights moving through the forest at night, similar to the lights Jacob Reeves had, reported in 1842. In 1996, precisely 154 years after the initial disappearance, a documentary filmmaker named David Brennan made the decision to make a film about the Callahan case. Having read a brief mention of the case in a book about Appalachian legends, he became interested in the mystery, and as a skeptic who doesn't believe in ghosts or curses, he saw the project as a chance to investigate how urban legends evolve and endure over time. David Brennan spent 6 months carefully researching the case before shooting. Excited by the discovery, David organized an expedition to the property with a small crew, a cameraman, a sound technician, and a local guide familiar with the mountains. They set out on a clear September morning with modern equipment after discovering Robert Thatcher's sealed box in the university archives and deciding to open it. Inside were all of Thatcher's notes, including photographs of the former estate, detailed maps, and most importantly, the exact location where he had found the buried bones. Filming equipment and GPS to make sure they wouldn't get lost. The trip to the property was more challenging than they had expected. The old trails had completely vanished and had been replaced by thick vegetation. As they got closer to their destination, the local guide, Earl Dawson, a man in his 60s, became more and more anxious, muttering that the area had always had a bad reputation, that his grandfather had warned him not to go there, and that animals avoided that specific patch of forest. When they finally arrived at the ruins in the middle of the afternoon, sunlight filtered through the thick canopy of trees overhead, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to move and shift constantly. David started filming right away, documenting the ruins and the surrounding forest and making narrative notes about the site's history. Using Thatcher's coordinates, they located the supposed location of the bones, and David decided they would do a small exploratory dig, just enough too. They dug carefully for about an hour, and about 15 inches down, their shovels struck something solid. With their hands, they carefully cleared the surrounding earth and revealed bones, but something was seriously wrong. The bones hadn't decomposed normally, they had a strange, almost black coloration, and they were covered in markings that were definitely not there. He didn't plan to disturb any remains they found, just document their existence and then notify the appropriate authorities. His initial excitement had turned into something more complex, a mix of academic fascination and growing unease. The sound technician, a man named Marcus Reed, kept reporting strange interference in his equipment. The symbols were complex, etched deep into the bone, forming patterns that seemed meaningful but that no one in the group could decipher. David Brennan meticulously filmed everything, capturing close-ups of the marked bones, the abnormal coloration, the carved symbols. A steady low-frequency hum that shouldn't be heard in a remote forest, and sometimes his recorder picked up what sounded like whispering voices, despite the fact that only the 4 crew members were present. Local guide Earl Dawson was clearly upset and pleaded with them to stop digging, leave the bones where they were, and depart right away. There was a genuine, unfaked fear in his voice that even the doubtful David found difficult to ignore, but curiosity won out, and David made the decision to. Digging a little deeper, just to see how many bones were buried there, they discovered something that shouldn't have been there. A metal brooch, rusted but still recognizable among the ancient bones, partially buried in the dark earth. James Park, the cameraman, carefully picked it up and cleaned it, and there was an inscription on the back. Jennifer Walsh, class of 1976. The silence that descended upon the group was absolute. Unless someone had dug it up, discovered the bones, buried the brooch with them, and then covered it all up again, how had Jennifer's brooch ended up buried with bones that were supposedly from 1842? David was trying to think of a logical explanation when Earl yelled, pointing at the surrounding forest with a pale face. Everyone turned to look, and among the trees, partially hidden by shadows, were figures. Several figures standing completely. Still, just watching. It was hard to tell how many there were because of the filtered light and dancing shadows, but there were a lot of them. Maybe dozens. James started filming the figures right away, but when he looked through the camera's viewfinder, he saw nothing. He pulled the camera away, and when he looked through the camera again, he saw nothing but trees and shadows. Marcus checked his sound equipment and saw that the levels were completely out of control, making noises in the range of a jet engine, even though everything appeared to be silent to him. Earl didn't wait any longer. He just started running, leaving the group and disappearing into the woods toward the trail they'd taken. His panic was infectious, and David yelled for them to pack up everything right away. Instead of trying to cover the bones again, they just dropped everything and began following Earl as quickly as they could. The flight through this, it took them nearly 3 hours to find their way back to their vehicles, despite the fact that the forest was chaotic and frightening. The figures seemed to be everywhere now, always at the edge of vision, always silent, always watching, and Marcus swore he saw children among the figures. Children with pale faces and ancient clothes, just as the college students had described 22 years earlier. James stumbled and fell, dropping his expensive camera, which rolled down the slope, and he simply got up and continued running without even trying to retrieve it. When they finally emerged onto the road where they had left their trucks, Earl was already there, sitting on the ground beside his vehicle, shaking uncontrollably. The outward journey had taken less than 2 hours, and it seemed as though the forest had reorganized around them. The trails they had meticulously marked were simply no longer where they should have been. Neither of them spoke the entire way back, as if words were insufficient to process what they had gone through. When they arrived at the closest village, David made. James had saved the memory cards from the main camera before they started digging, tucking them into his pocket as a standard precaution to ensure they wouldn't lose all their work for the day. A few days later, when he was alone, he reviewed the footage, and what he saw made him wonder. He informed the others that he was canceling the documentary, that everything they had filmed would be destroyed, and that nobody would ever know about that expedition. His own sanity. Several times during the filming process, when the camera was centered on David's speech or the ruins, figures appeared in the background, at the edge of the frame, and they were unquestionably absent during the filming process. However, when James paused on these particular frames and zoomed in, he saw faces, adult and child faces all, with expressions of unfathomable suffering. James made copies of those memory cards and kept them in a safe. He never showed the video to anyone, but he also couldn't bring himself to destroy it because it was proof of something extraordinary, something that contradicted everything he believed to be true. Over the next few years, he became fixated on the Callahan case, gathering all the information he could find and creating a sizable private archive. In 2003, James found Jennifer Walsh, who was living in Canada after moving from the United States decades prior. When he got in touch with her and brought up the brooch, Jennifer became frightened. She claimed that she had misplaced the brooch during the night they camped on the property in 1974, thinking it had fallen somewhere during their frantic escape. The idea that it had been discovered buried with the ancient bones made her physically ill. Jennifer then disclosed something she had never told anyone, not even the other students who were with her that night. She had been having the same dream ever since. Hundreds of times over, almost 30 years, she was back in those woods in the dream, but it was nighttime. Bonfires were burning, and people wearing old clothes were doing some sort of ritual around the bones. She recognized faces among them, including Sheriff Hadley, Robert Thatcher, and people she had never met in person but whose faces she recognized from old photos related to the Callahan case. All of them turned to stare at her at once, and their eyes were entirely black. "You touched what you shouldn't have," they all said at once. "Now you're part of it." Jennifer would always wake up from this dream in a panic, drenched in cold sweats, and it took her hours to relax enough to sleep again. James told Jennifer about his own findings, including the figures in the video, and they talked on the phone for hours, comparing experiences and trying to make sense of the unthinkable before reaching a startling conclusion. Whatever had happened to the property wasn't just haunted in the conventional sense. It was something much more complex, as if that particular piece of land existed in multiple temporalities simultaneously. Jennifer added, "Since that night in 1974, I'd been keeping track of news reports of unexplained disappearances in the Appalachian region, and ever since then, there was a pattern. The Callahan family's 1842 story wasn't over. It was still happening in some way that defied linear understanding of time. Every 7 years or so, someone would go missing in the mountains close to the old Callahan property. These people could be hunters, hikers, or even a geologist conducting research. No bodies were ever discovered. Searches were never successful, and witnesses frequently reported seeing strange lights or figures in the woods just before the disappearances. Jennifer Walsh's discovery of the pattern of disappearances every 7 years added another level of mystery to the case. Spent the next few months painstakingly going through missing person records in Harland County and the surrounding areas going all the way back to 1842. The work was so thorough that he had to visit dozens of libraries, records offices, and historical archives in 3 different states. What he found supported Jennifer's pattern, but it also showed something even more unsettling. The disappearances weren't random. Each person who vanished had some sort of connection, no matter how slight, to the Whitmore family or the former Callahan estate. In some cases, it was a distant genealogical connection found only through obscure 19th century marriage and baptism records. In other cases, it was a physical connection, involving people who had visited the estate, handled artifacts recovered from it, or even just thoroughly researched the case. For instance, Robert Thatcher had never vanished, but his car accident happened precisely 7 years after his visit to the estate. The 5 college students from 1974, while not physically absent, all went through severe trauma. Events that occurred in their lives within 7 years of that night. One of them passed away in an unexplained house fire 7 years later, and another experienced sudden and severe schizophrenia precisely 14 years after the visit. The pattern persisted, unrelenting, like a cosmic clock ticking in a way that defied coincidence, until 2008, 34 years after the students' visit and 66 years after Thatcher's discovery. The U.S. Forest Service announced plans to construct a new recreational trail that would pass close to the former Callahan property. It was part of a larger initiative to revitalize tourism in the Appalachians and included clearing vegetation, installing informational signs, and even building a small shelter for hikers. James Park, who was now totally engrossed in the case, saw this as a potential disaster and launched a campaign to block the project, contacting local historians, environmental organizations, and anyone else with influence. He also made a website and wrote letters to newspapers. In June 2008, a team of 12 workers was assigned to start clearing vegetation and marking the trail. For the first 3 days, everything seemed normal, but on the morning of the 4th day, 2 of the workers simply did not show up. Their colleagues assumed they had quit, which is not uncommon on difficult forestry projects. He was committed to keeping the area as a nature sanctuary, but he couldn't explain the true reason for his opposition without sounding completely insane. He was working with a chainsaw, felling smaller trees, when he simply dropped the equipment and walked into the forest. His coworkers called out to him, but he didn't respond, kept walking as if in a trance, and they tried to follow him but somehow lost sight of him. A week later, another worker vanished, and this time there were witnesses. The supervisor tried to reach them by phone and found that they had both left their homes during the night, taking nothing but the clothes they were wearing. The project was suspended indefinitely after extensive searches turned up no evidence of him. Gerald Stone, the project's pragmatic supervisor, acknowledged in an official report that there was a serious problem with that specific section of the forest, citing equipment that broke down without warning, compasses that spun wildly, and an oppressive feeling that made even the most seasoned workers extremely uncomfortable. The report was shelved, the project was officially canceled for budgetary reasons, and no one spoke. Publicly discussing it once more, however, Gerald Stone was unable to let it go. He started his own investigation, discovered the Callahans' account, and eventually got in touch with James Park. The two, the skeptical forestry supervisor and the obsessed cameraman, formed an unlikely alliance because they were both convinced that something horrible and unexplainable was happening in those mountains. In 2010, they made the decision to make one final trip to the property, this time with much more meticulous preparation, hired a small but specialized team. They brought high-definition cameras with night vision, sensitive audio recorders, and even electromagnetic field meters, though none of them really knew what they would find with such instruments, as well as a forensic anthropologist, a historian who specialized in Appalachian cultures, and a technologist with sophisticated environmental monitoring equipment. The expedition was scheduled to last only 1 day, from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., giving them enough time to arrive, document what they could, and depart before nightfall. The forensic anthropologist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, swiftly located the previous excavation site using GPS, and they started a new, meticulous, and methodical excavation, this time documenting everything with scientific precision. They arrived without incident, and at first everything seemed peaceful, with the forest being quiet but not unnaturally so, with the sound of a gentle breeze rustling the leaves and the occasional bird song. Dr. Chen verified that the bones were unquestionably human from 7 different individuals, ranging in age from about 4 to 40 years. The preservation was unusual for bones over 150 years old. And the engraved symbols were completely perplexing, as they corresponded to no known writing system, no documented cultural tradition. They were still in the exact location where they had been left years earlier. Were distinctive, and the accuracy with which they were engraved suggested sophisticated anatomical knowledge and intentional purpose. The historian, a man named Professor Marcus Whitfield, identified some elements in the symbols, stating that they seemed to be a disturbing combination of Native American symbols unique to the Appalachian region, ancient Celtic markings, and something else he couldn't identify. It was as if several esoteric traditions had been combined into something new and sinister. As they worked, the technologist, Kevin. The temperature in the excavation area was consistently 4 degrees colder than the surrounding forest with no clear explanation, and Lou kept an eye on his instruments. The electromagnetic field meters displayed odd fluctuations and spikes of activity without a known source. The sensitive recorders picked up low-frequency sounds that were below the threshold of normal human hearing, but Kevin processed them through software to raise their frequency so they could be heard, and they sounded unsettlingly similar, too. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, things started to go wrong. Cameras started to malfunction at the same time. Fully charged batteries ran out in a matter of minutes. Cell phones stopped working, even those with weak signal before, and then they started to see the figures, not from the sidelines this time, but right in front of the trees. The figures were dressed in period attire, some from the 19th century, others much older. Gerald Stone decided it was time to leave right away, and they started packing their equipment with trembling hands. They came closer, but they didn't go away either. They stayed there, motionless among the trees, watching with an intensity that could be physically felt. Despite her scientific training, Dr. Sarah Chen felt something she had never experienced in decades of forensic work. Absolute primal terror, the kind of fear that exists at the cellular level, engraved in human DNA through millions of years of evolution. The figures started to multiply, dozens, then hundreds, forming a circle that slowly closed around the clearing where they worked, and Kevin Liu noticed something on his meters that stopped him in his tracks. They were all trying to keep a semblance of professional calm, but everyone felt the same way. The forest had changed, and it was no longer just a physical place, but something alive and conscious, and they were not welcome there. He glanced at the others and uttered the shaky words, "This isn't physically possible," as the temperature was rapidly dropping by 5 degrees every minute. Whatever's going on here is going against basic laws of physics. Professor Whitfield had a sudden epiphany as he examined the symbols on the bones one final time before they departed, realizing that they were more than just markings. They were a form of imprisonment, an effort to bind something or someone to that. James Park realized they were being purposefully herded, like cattle being driven into a corral, and he yelled at the others to change direction, cutting through the dense vegetation instead of following. The escape was chaotic but strangely organized. Instead of attacking them, the figures seemed to guide them, forcing them to follow a specific path through the forest. They fought through thorny bushes and dense vines, tearing at clothing and skin, until they finally emerged into an area that seemed less oppressive. while the figures didn't follow them past a certain point, as if there were an invisible boundary they couldn't or wouldn't cross. The team continued running until they reached the vehicles, and no one looked back until they were miles away. That night, gathered in a jeep. Dr. Chen had the bone samples she had collected, carefully stored in sterile containers. Kevin had some surviving recordings from before the equipment failed. Professor Whitfield had photographs of the symbols. It was concrete proof of something extraordinary, but also profoundly dangerous. They decided that the bone samples would be sent to a laboratory for dating and analysis, but anonymously and without identifying where they were kept. They stayed at a motel in the closest town and attempted to make sense of what they had experienced. When the carbon dating results came back 3 months later, they were impossible to find. The bones were dated from different periods, some actually dating from the mid-9th century, but others were much older, some over 300 years old. The recordings and photographs would be archived, but not published, and they would never speak publicly about what actually happened that day. The truth was just too big, too strange, and possibly too dangerous to share openly. James Park spent the next few years gathering all he knew about the Callahan case into a massive manuscript he never intended to publish. For his own understanding, it was an attempt to organize decades of fragmented information into something coherent. He documented every disappearance, every visit to the property, every strange event connected to that cursed land. It was as if time itself were distorted in that place, different layers of history existing simultaneously. Unquestionably, the land took its toll every 7 years, and nothing seemed to be able to stop the cycle. In 2015, James received an unexpected letter from an elderly woman residing in a North Carolina nursing home. She claimed to be descended from the Blackwood family, the same family that had cursed Jonathan Whitmore almost 200 years earlier, after reading a brief mention of the Callahan case in an obscure mystery magazine. Elenina Blackwood, a 93-year-old woman, wrote that her family had preserved all the records that had been passed down from generation to generation, including tales of the stolen land and the sworn vengeance. She claimed that when the Blackwoods cursed the Whitmores, they did more than simply condemn a family. They tied the debt to the land itself, establishing a connection between the physical plane and something much older and darker. The land had turned into a portal, a point of intersection between worlds, and the Callahan spirits were. Elenina wrote that her family had attempted over the years to undo what had been done. But curses of that kind, rooted in deep pain and entwining multiple ancient traditions, could not be simply undone. They took on a life of their own, becoming entities separate from their creators, and true reconciliation, genuine forgiveness on both sides, and restitution of the stolen land to its rightful owners were the only ways to break them. Eleanor passed away 3 weeks after sending that letter, and James went to the funeral to meet the few surviving members of the Blackwood family, ordinary people leading ordinary lives while bearing the burden of a history they hardly understood. But how can one forgive when all the original parties have been dead for more than a century? How can one restore land that no longer belongs to anyone? They validated Elenina's statements by presenting James with old family records written and faded. The Blackwoods of 1823 were not merely seeking retribution. They were attempting to defend a place of power that had been revered for many generations prior to the arrival of the colonists. Jonathan Whitmore had desecrated this place, built upon it, and documented the precise manner in which the curse had been cast in notebooks and diaries from 1823. The rituals described were intricate and unsettling, involving blood, bone, and earth, words in languages that blended ancient Gaelic with extinct native dialects, claimed ownership of something that could never be possessed. James finally realized that the Callahan family had not been killed in the conventional sense, but had instead been drawn through the veil, changed into guardians, and imprisoned between worlds to guard the gateway that should never have been constructed. Every person who had vanished since then was being added to the guardians, strengthening the seal that kept something terrible contained. It was terrible, but it was also necessary. Today, in 2025, the former Callahan property. The Forest Service maintains the area as a wildlife sanctuary, but few animals actually live there. Warning signs have been placed nearby, warning of dangerous terrain and landslide risks, but the true reason is still unknown. The area shows up on official maps, but hiking trails carefully avoid it. James Park, now 78, is still alive and keeps his extensive case file updated with any new information. The 7-year pattern continues. The last person to go missing was a nature photographer who vanished in 2022. The Callahan cabin stood again, whole and solid, with lamplight shining through the windows, figures moving inside, living as if it were still 1842. We may never fully understand what happened on that property in the Kentucky mountains nearly 200 years ago. We may never know exactly where the Callahan family is or if they still exist. He disregarded all warnings and camped near the ruins for 3 nights. His camera was discovered, memory cards intact, showing photographs of something that seems impossible. Experience what we might refer to as consciousness. But the land remembers that the forest holds its secrets. On quiet nights when the wind blows through the Appalachian valleys, they claim you can still hear children laughing or maybe crying, echoes of a family trapped between worlds, repaying a debt that was never really theirs in the first place. If you're ever traveling through the eastern Kentucky mountains and come across a place where the forest suddenly grows darker, where birds don't sing, and the air seems thicker, maybe it's best to move on. Some stories don't have happy endings, some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some debts once etched into the very fabric of reality continue to be collected, generation after generation eternally. If you were moved by this story and experienced the same chills as we did as we uncovered each new layer of this dark story, please like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment if you've had any unexplained experiences in the mountains, or if you are aware of other tales that have been forgotten. Sometimes, preserving these tales is the only way to pay tribute to those who have been forgotten until the next exploration of the most unsettling mysteries in history.